My name is Noah Keteyian, and I am here from We Communications with my colleague Elizabeth. And we have some, I hope, interesting information to share with you today about the purpose and meaning of leadership today. So we will we'll just kick things off and get things started here just momentarily. Thank you for all coming in with us. So let me begin here today. My name is Noah Keteyian, and I'm here from We Communications. And I hope that you are all feeling inspired after the opening sessions from the main stage today here at Social Innovation Summit. I am certainly delighted to be here as always. We Communications is a strategic communications consultancy. We work globally with a range of companies on purpose-driven communications. And so we have some, what we hope will be some great information to share today about how leaders are rethinking their role and meaning and mindset related to purpose. And that's something that's already, we've already talked about a bit today in the main stage. So I'm talking to you from Seattle today. And I also have with me my colleague, Elizabeth.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Herrera Smith, and I'm an Executive Vice President at We Communications, and I head our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. My role today really spans both the internal programs, policies, and practices that really advance our DEI efforts for the agency. And I also continue to have some of my time spent on consulting with clients on their own DEI communications efforts.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So what we would like to do today is share with you some research findings that we conducted recently that get a bit more into the heart and action related to purpose and leadership and where business and NGO leaders are today. And just to give you a sense of how we'll spend our time over the next hour, we would like to share with you some of these insights. We're going to take you through some of them in a presentation format. For that time, if everyone would consider muting from your end, we'll try to share out some information, and we will hold some time at the end for more in-depth discussion and questions. So hopefully what we'll share with you will be thought-provoking, and that'll get some questions and insights from your end as well, and we would love to hear from you. In the meantime, please put your questions or thoughts in the chat as they come up. We're happy to hear those. We'll try to answer them as we go so that we can keep this a little more interactive, but also know that we will reserve some time at the end once you've had the opportunity to absorb a bit of what we have to share. So with that, I know people are still coming in and joining from the main stage, but I think we can get started, and we'll share some of what we have for you today. At We Communications, we really focus on counseling our clients at companies like Microsoft and Volvo and organizations like the Gates Foundation on communications challenges and opportunities. And one of the ways that we do that is that we ground ourselves in insights and research so that we can really figure out how to take these ideas like purpose and make them more tangible and actionable. And so that's what we hope today is to share with you some of those insights and some of the ways that we see them taking those ideas more from insight into action. And in particular today, we want to talk about rethinking the purpose and meaning of leadership in this particularly unique time that we have all been living through. So as we think about this time of transition, think for yourself for a moment. What word best describes your mindset? And I'll give you a couple of options here. Weariness, optimism, determination. If you had to pick one word to describe your mindset at this transition point, just take a moment, quiet your mind, think inside yourself, what word really describes where you're at today as you look ahead into this year? I'll just give you a moment to think about that and really pick one. So we surveyed 300 C-suite executives, senior level managers, and key decision makers around the world, focusing our markets in the United States, UK, and Singapore. And we asked them a range of questions to better get at this sense of what is their mindset at this transition moment as we come out of an incredible time globally that saw just shocking upheaval in all ways, certainly the pandemic for all of us, but also in many other ways when you think about the changing in awareness and action coming after the murder of George Floyd in the United States and the way that spread globally, the political upheavals that we have experienced around the world. It has been an extraordinary time for everyone. We wanted to get a sense of, for leaders of organizations, companies, movements, where were their heads at? What are they thinking about as they make the transition that I just asked you about? And what are the changes in leadership that are required and how will they go about it? So what we're going to share with you is some of the insights from that survey of those 300 leaders from around the world. And what did we learn about their mindset? So getting back to that question I asked you, first of all, what we heard from them was when we asked them, what are all of the words that come to mind as you make this transition from this challenging time into a time of new challenges? They gave us a range of negative and positive emotions, a lot of feelings from sadness to remorse to anxiety, but also hopefulness. The thing that came through more than any other was the sense of determination. And I just think that's a really fascinating and interesting place to start off as we begin this discussion of leadership mindset, which is to say that, yes, they felt bad and they felt good, just like the rest of us in all of these ways. But they're thinking about leading their movements and organizations, and they have a sense of determination. And for me, that means that there is this desire to do more and to make some change and to really move forward. And I think that's a really interesting place to be. It's sort of a combination of coming out of a challenging time, having some optimism and a desire to take action to move forward. Now, I think it's really important for us to step back a moment and understand the context for these leaders and what they're experiencing. So, things have really changed in terms of our expectations around leaders, their roles, their organizations, their brands, and the actions that they will take to activate purpose in the world. First of all, the generational shift is making the public much louder, more socially connected, and it's really leading stakeholder voices to increase pressure on all kinds of organizations, companies, brands around the world. And so bold action by these companies and brands on the major issues like environment and social equality are expected in very new and bigger ways by the entire range of stakeholder set for these organizations. Leaders have to really now be the face and voice on a wide range of issues and policies. And it's important to recognize that that is a changing and rising expectation for these leaders of organizations, leaders at all levels, that they have to speak to with some great clarity and maybe some boldness around issues that company leaders especially really were not expected to lead on 20 years ago. And politics adds a kind of volatility and uncertainty in all kinds of different global and regional contexts that has really upended the expectations and the places that leaders find themselves having to make these decisions. So in this research, we discovered that leadership is in the midst of a significant transformation. Traditionally, leaders have been celebrated for their boldness and confidence when we think about the kinds of qualities that leaders at all levels and all kinds are expected to be. They've been celebrated for pursuing a vision with really relentless focus coming from the top, never showing any doubt or uncertainty. And to be vulnerable really was seen to be weak. And that's changed. Expectations have shifted. Leaders are starting to see themselves in a new light. So as we look at some of what we found in our research, the past year has prompted this deep kind of introspection in leaders about their role in the changed world. 86% of the people we talked about say that they've become more introspective. So by looking within, they're examining their own conscience and conviction with new levels of honesty and vulnerability. That's a really different kind of expectation for someone in a leadership role. More than half of the folks that we talk to say they've deepened their awareness of their personal fears, their limitations, their defenses and impulses, the way they're working to identify gaps between their intentions and their actions. And that's one we'll come back to again and again, that leaders are really examining by looking within. They're really examining that gap between intention and action, the ways that they are meaning to act and address certain issues, and the way they are expected to and actually making change in the world. So look at someone like John Donahoe, who is the CEO of Nike. And I think that he and other leaders are using a new kind of language. And I will say that as communications professionals, we think about the language that people use quite a lot and the ways that leaders express themselves. That's one important way that leaders make impact inside and outside their organizations with that full range of stakeholders. And so you see them using words like vulnerability and accountability. And that is a new kind of way for leaders to talk and express their role. John Donahoe, for example, has talked about being on a wisdom tour to better understand how to be a leader in a new way. And he said that it's important to find the things in your life for which you have accountability and there's consequence. It doesn't have to be one big thing, but find meaningful things in your life. And this is the leader of a big brand, a big company, talking about how he thinks about his job and his role. So we want to examine that language. We want to think about how leaders are talking, but we also want to think about the new ways that they're taking action and leading.
So from this introspection that Noah has been talking about has really emerged some new ways to think, act, and lead in 2021. And each of these things are critically important to how a business or organization is showing up and having impact on the world. It's everything from how leaders are engaging with and acting on employee concerns and aspirations, all the way to how leaders are going beyond some of the traditional constituencies that they may have turned to and really seeking broader guidance from a larger community of stakeholders so that they're taking into account those differing perspectives. So what we're going to cover in this next part of the session is some of the attributes, behaviors, and how-tos that really emerged from what we heard from leaders in how they're navigating these new waters. So what we heard from leaders is that 71% of them say that articulating their personal core values is more important than it was a year ago. What this indicates to us is that leaders are really responding to these new expectations from their stakeholders for greater transparency and really infusing that into the way that they are making business decisions. Now, this is not to say that leaders have to put all of their personal values on public display, but it is to say that those leaders who are able to find greater alignment between their personal values and the company values have a much stronger foundation from which to drive purposeful engagement and action in a much more authentic way. I think we'd all agree that Hamdi Ulukaya, the CEO of Chobani, is a really good example of this. And his quote really captures well this notion of purposeful leadership. He says, "We do not have to wait for the government to act on it. We as businesses and CEOs and brands must do our responsibility, and this is the time to do it." Now, Hamdi is a Kurdish immigrant, and he's really used that lived perspective and his personal core values to establish the very foundation upon which he built Chobani. He hires refugees into his factories. He's brought new jobs into these small communities that were once abandoned by larger companies. In fact, the first Chobani factory was created in a factory that was abandoned by Kraft Foods. He's also pledged to give employees an ownership stake in this privately held company. Hamdi really leads from a shared purpose and responsibility to his employees, and he asks that they do the same for one another. And I think that we're starting to see this deeper sense of purpose and meaning extend further and deeper out into corporate America, particularly when you think about everything that was happening in the last year. Following the murder of George Floyd, according to the AP, what we heard is that corporate America was donating to racial equity causes at a historic amount, far surpassing the donations of foundations and individual philanthropists to the tune of $8.2 billion. So you can see as those rising expectations from employees and stakeholders continue to increase, the need to lead with purpose becomes even more critical. So how then are leaders finding this opportunity to activate a more constant state of introspection? Well, what we discovered as part of our research is that they're really taking a three-part approach. First, they are seeking self-awareness in real time. It used to be that the notion of self-reflection and that moment to step away and look inward was really seen as a personal luxury. I think we've seen many leaders throughout history take silent retreats or think weeks to really come back with that greater sense of purpose and clarity for how they were going to guide their organizations further. And certainly there's still room for that, and it's still necessary. But what we're also hearing from leaders is that they're needing to seek that self-awareness in real time, in the present moment, based on some of the complex issues that they're being asked to respond to. They're also reflecting on their beliefs and acknowledging their own actions and the reverberations that those have, not only on their organizations, but extending far beyond that to all of the stakeholders that they're accountable to. I think Corey Berry, the CEO of Best Buy, really captures well the need for introspection and why purpose is so important in how you lead a company forward. What she says is that they will help steer you toward what is important and the stance you will take. Not everyone is going to be happy, but if you stay clear on your purpose, you unleash massive amounts of commitment. And that is very true for all of the benefits that taking a stand and being very clear on your purpose can bring to an organization. It is certainly not without risk. In a recent Wall Street Journal article, the CEO of Ben & Jerry's, Matthew McCarthy, said that oftentimes he gets asked by people, gosh, aren't you afraid of alienating consumers with the stand that you're taking at Ben & Jerry's? And he simply responds, actually, it's the exact opposite. He is very clear about what Ben & Jerry's stands for, and they have always had a deep-rooted history of taking a stand on social and racial injustices and equity issues. And that has delivered a lot of strong consumer loyalty, good business for them, but it is certainly not without its risks in alienating certain consumers, which he's been very clear he's okay with that. We've also seen the opposite of what happens when a leader or a company is unwilling to take a stand on anything. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this next example that I'm going to share. It's come from a company called Basecamp, a software company. In April of this year, the CEO declared a very public stance that they were no longer going to allow any social or political conversations to take place on company channels. And he declared this through a public-facing blog before even sharing with employees internally. As part of this declaration, they also talked about how they were going to disband all of the internal committees, including the DEI committee, and really go back to a place where leaders were going to declare the direction for the company. Now, keep in mind, the disbanding of these committees followed a particularly charged conversation that the DEI committee had recently had with leaders about the need for greater equity and inclusion at the company. So, as you might imagine, this public declaration was not well received, and it received very swift and fierce backlash from the public and employees alike. Ultimately, it resulted in a very heated town hall exchange where 57 of Basecamp's employees ultimately ended up resigning and taking the buyout package. So it really had significant business consequences for the company. So of the leadership behaviors that we asked respondents to rate, 69% of them said that stakeholder engagement is one of the most important leadership behaviors for 2021. And I think Basecamp proves that when you don't engage your stakeholders in the right way, it can have very negative implications for you. So part of that engagement really begins by listening and making sure that you are taking into account all of the diverse perspectives that are crucial to informing your point of view. The next thing that we discovered is that 74% say being collaborative with stakeholders is more important to them than it was a year ago. I think as we've talked about, the issues are so complex that there is no one way or right way to approach tackling some of these problems. And so as leaders become more comfortable with their own human vulnerability, they're more willing to acknowledge the gaps in their experience and reaching out to more diverse voices and points of view to learn from and engage with as they make these increasingly complex decisions.
And Elizabeth, I think it's really interesting too in these couple of points that you've laid out here about stakeholder engagement that when we were asking leaders, what are the most important leadership behaviors for you in the coming year? As the leader of, say, a company, what's the most important? They rated stakeholder engagement at the top of that list. And I think that is fascinating when you think about what business leaders especially have on their plates and the way they have oriented their roles, that they would look ahead into the coming year and say stakeholder engagement, among all the other things that I have to do as a leader, is at the top of my list. I think that is fascinating and really shows what a changed landscape they're operating in.
Absolutely. And then finally, as we think about, listening, learning, and engaging, 71% are putting more focus on learning and engagement with more diverse voices. I think we're seeing the importance of diversity in our businesses to ensure that we're able to really serve the stakeholders and constituencies that we're really trying to reach with our products and services. And so that need to broaden our perspective and inform our points of views has become more critical now than it ever has before. And I, for one, am pleased to see that that's happening. It is well overdue.
So as we think about those leaders and the ways that they are changing their mindset, their stance, their engagement with stakeholders, if there's one phrase that really embodies all of that and the way that leaders are setting themselves up into this, next phase of transition and transformation, it's tell me more. that's really the stance that we see leaders taking, the ones who are sort of the purpose-driven leaders. They're asking the question, they're listening, but they're also listening in that really active way, right? They're reaching out to those diverse stakeholder groups. They're bringing in a wider circle of advisors, and they're hearing new voices or voices that are new to them. And they're not just hearing those first steps. They're saying, okay, now tell me more, tell me more. That really seems to be the mindset for so many of these leaders as they're heading into this really probably extraordinary phase 2 transition that we're all entering into. And so as we think about all of these, some of these points that we've shared, there are some actions then that leaders are able to take in a really pragmatic way, right? So I think that's what's really interesting when we go back to this idea of determination. It's not just about how things feel different, because we all know that's really true. It's what are we going to do with that? What do we do next? And so when we think about this new leadership mindset and how leaders will activate around their purpose, there's a bit of a checklist that begins to emerge from some of these insights that we saw in this research, and we wanted to share that with this group today as we move ahead into a little more of a discussion session. So I'm not looking at the chat right now, but please do put comments in there and we can start to pull some of those questions out and discuss a little further. But first of all, align and articulate purpose and values. So this is a very tangible place where leaders can start to craft a purpose platform with a narrative that is authentic and lasting to stand up to these times of intense change. It's a great time to revisit that for organizations. Something like 89% of the folks that we talked to said that having a better, more clearly defined purpose is even more important this year than it was a year ago. Number two, listen with vulnerability. You heard Elizabeth get to this point. And then the tangible action around it is to set up processes and tools to understand those community and employee needs. Take the time to listen to their concerns and input. There are some very practical ways that organizations can do this. Number three, broaden your circle of influence. Seek out and map the overlapping issues between your purpose and what your stakeholders say matters most. That's another very practical step to take to turn that listening into the learning and engagement that Elizabeth talked about. Number four, drive change through sustained action. Develop an action plan to go beyond check writing and create partnerships and initiatives that activate real change. One of the things that we heard from this set of leaders was that as they look ahead to driving change in their communities in positive ways, is that while they were planning to give of their resources for various causes, they also recognize that just writing a check is not the most impactful thing they can do, that they need to be more directly engaged with the communities where those checks would go, because they need to listen and engage. And that leads us to number five, which is to collaborate, connect, and co-create. So this has been an intense time of isolation for many communities. We can overcome that by empowering employees in particular as a first audience to own that change, and then widening that circle out to the broader set of stakeholders, so that you're turning that listening, that active listening, that tell me more, into engagement in a way where you're co-creating that change with the affected stakeholders and communities. So those are a set of tangible actions that we hope come out of these insights that that leaders can take to really activate positive change and connect to purpose in their wider stakeholder communities. And with that, having set you up with all kinds of new, I hope, stimulating insights, would love to look through some of your questions a bit and have a bit more conversation, as we do have some more time in our session. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and we'll take a look and see what folks have to say. So I'm starting to look through the questions, Elizabeth, and I'm sure you are too. I don't know if anyone has
No
shared.
questions yet. A lot of requests for the presentation, which I think Katie has shared a link to the research, so you have access to that.
Well, thank you very much, Katie, for that. I will say just another couple of points about the research. We have some of the research findings that you'll see. Katie linked us to the set of research that is a bit of it's a pretty easy read. I think, it's probably 15 pages and get through it pretty easily. And there are additional insights on top of the ones that we shared today. So you can get a little bit deeper into what were some of the specific data points that led us to some of the conclusions that we shared with you today, and some other examples as well. I'll also say that this set of research with these global leaders is something that we have done different angles on in the past. So some of the data that we looked at was a bit longitudinal over the last 3 years. Talking to a similar set of global leaders in those regions. So you see, and I would say that some of the broader points, like the one that I mentioned, that the expectations continue to rise on leaders, and that they are more focused on defining and taking action on their purpose. Those numbers have risen somewhat dramatically over the last couple of years. We saw more than 10-point increase on that one point in particular, that leaders seek to define their purpose better more than they did a year ago. So I think there's a lot that's interesting. I do see a couple of questions coming in here too. Let's see, thank you.
Yeah, we can just start with the first question, Noah. So one of the questions from Amy Hunter is, can you tell us how to engage in conversations of leadership and diversity racial issues, recruitment, retention, and onboarding? And I think that you hit the nail on the head when you said conversations with leadership. It has to start there. It must be embedded throughout the entirety of the organization and be understood as creating business value for the company. Without that, it's a much harder conversation to have, because it then becomes more of this HR function. When I was appointed to the role of head of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was really important to me to understand where that role was going to sit within the organization. And so the way it's been established is I report into the CEO, because at the end of the day, it all begins and ends at the very top of the company. And so if I don't have the CEO's buy-in, it's going to be much harder for me to be able to implement and impact change. I think the other important piece of this is that you've got to get the rest of your leadership involved in these conversations, because the reality is, even if you have somebody who's been appointed into this role, they are typically one person with a smaller team of people supporting them. And so culture is created by everyone within the organization. And leaders really have an opportunity to set the tone for that culture within their teams and business units. So it's incredibly important that they feel very committed to and educated about how the company is approaching those diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts.
The next question I see here is around the language. Did the language of agency, both personal and collective, come up in collecting data, or was the language focused on collaboration, co-create, et cetera? That's a great question. That action step that you're referring to is our interpretation about a next step to take coming out of the insights. But what I will say is that what we saw in the research particularly was that empowerment certainly came up I would say empowerment and active listening were two that came up. So we were talking to a set of leaders, asking them what ways, what mindset shifts, and what ways they were changing how they would address their own roles. So we were asking them, how will you be different? How will you as a leader do things differently? And interestingly, what they said was, we see empowering others, and that includes employees and community members, so both inside and outside the organization, so empowering those people, but also working together with them. And that's where there is that sense of co-creation. So it's not so much just a top down or an outside in, we think this is what the community needs, but this is more about hearing what the community needs and then beginning a back and forth to figure out how we can work together to start to make that change in a positive way. And I think that is a real shift for some of these large organizations. I see the next question is about, for leaders going through this journey, what kind of resources do you think are available to guide them? How can they become more comfortable with vulnerability? Is it through coaching? Elizabeth, I have one thought about this, and I don't know if you have another, but I'll just start in. So certainly, coaching is part of that. And because I don't think, as we said at the beginning, I don't think this is something that comes naturally to many people who find themselves in leadership positions today. That may be shifting as generations shift, but it is clear that that's not the expectation that has brought a lot of leaders to their position. And so it really does take concerted effort and training. There are very clear ways to become a more vulnerable leader. It's not magic at all. There are very clear steps. I know certainly within our own organization that we have sought training to be better, more vulnerable leaders. And so I think those kinds of resources are very important. In our work as communications consultants, we look at we do very much look at how leaders show up and how they interact with stakeholders and communities. And so we embed that very much in our counsel to them as well.
I think it often helps too, Noah, in some of the work that we've done with leaders to look out at the peer landscape and give them a sense for how other leaders are showing up in the world and how that's really impacting the share of voice that they have and how they're getting their perspective out to their stakeholders and their communities. When they're able to see it in action, it then becomes a little bit more tangible for them on how they can take their own vulnerability and personal story and use that to really convey what it is they're trying to do within the company and that sense of purpose in the world. We often do intake sessions where we're asking some personal questions, and we'll always meet leaders where they're at in their own journey. Not everyone is going to be ready to go from 0 to 60 overnight. And so you stair step them through that process to see how far you can get them outside of that comfort zone to be able to share more of those personal stories that make leaders human and relatable to their employees, to their external, customers and partners in a way that is going to ultimately get them to a better place in how they're leading their companies.
That's such a good point about that, that kind of spectrum of where everybody's at. Not everybody is in the same place. I mean, when I think about some of those examples that you shared, Elizabeth, Corey Berry at Best Buy, or Ben & Jerry's, these Nike, right? Like, these are not all leaders and companies that are at the same place, and that's okay.
That's exactly right. Not every company is going to be an activist company. Sometimes it's okay to be on the other side of the spectrum where you're more an advocate and you're inching your way toward more of those activist actions.
But I will say, I think one of the ways to get at that is having that clearly defined purpose and clear definition around how you're going to activate related to that purpose. That begins to give you a bit of a roadmap, as opposed to feeling, I think, just sort of at sea about what comes next and stabbing at the wind, which actually leads me to the next question, this more general question, right, around steering clear of the look and feel of buzzwords and idea du jour. We've all lived through greenwashing. we know authenticity is key. And so I think that is, to my mind, that is a big part of how we avoid that kind of thing, right? Because I think it's very easy for everyone to identify, oh, I'm supposed to, be more performative and talk about, whatever the sort of cultural moment is right now. And one way that is really important is to, that first point we made about clearly defining and articulating purpose and the actions that you'll take against those, so that you are always coming from, in terms of your communications, but also your actions, coming from that sort of clearly defined core and not jumping around to the latest thing, whatever it is, because having that clearly defined core then allows you to address those things as they do come up, because new things do come up, things become more important to stakeholders, and you do have to figure out how to interact and communicate about those. The other piece about that is really important is that long-term sustained investment, so that it's not just about putting out a statement, or a tweet to say, hey, this thing's really important. It's how do you back that up? How do you demonstrate as an organization that this is something that we're investing in for the long haul? And being transparent about how you reach that decision. And that's, again, where you get to that listening, learning, and engagement with the community, right? That's the process for defining how you take action. And then activating some transparency around that and being in it for the long haul is what really makes it real.
Okay, I think we have another question in here that says, are businesses stronger if all culture and change comes from the top down, or can bottom up organizations thrive and grow? Does leadership set the tone, or listen, facilitate, and sieve the ideas to find the best path forward while letting the thinkers have the credit? If leadership is facilitation, are CEOs overpaid? It's a very good question. I mean, I think what we're finding is that it really isn't a top down or even a bottoms up approach. It's a co-creation, collaborative approach that is required for organizations today to really address the complexity of the issues and take into account the diverse perspectives that are going to have a stake in the decisions that you're making for the organization. So I would definitely say the shift is more to a collaborative mindset where everyone is coming together to determine what that path forward looks like. Now, that's not to say that the CEO doesn't have accountability and responsibility for ultimately deciding. You can't always decide by committee. But it is to say that it is important to take in as many points of view as you can, and then be very grounded in where you stand and what aligns with the company values to be able to get to a place where there's a clear path forward.
Yeah, it's really true. I'm looking at this next question. Do you have thoughts on how we make it easier for leaders to own their own past missteps, protecting people's dignity and ability to opt into a new era? It's such a good question that I think so many people are wrestling with in this, sort of world where there is so much more communication, so much more transparency. The things we've said live on in a way that we could ignore them in the past. And one of the, I think this is one of the important things about vulnerability, right? That when we saw leaders in this survey talking about examining what they've said and the impact that they've had on others and how to bridge that gap, I think that's what we're really talking about here, is that there is something about the time that we have been living through over the past year, in combination of a few things happening at once, that does seem to have both allowed for more space, I think, for that introspection, but also forced it in a lot of cases, where people who are in leadership positions have had to recognize that they have even more responsibility than maybe they really acknowledged that they had around all kinds of new things, new for those leaders. though often not new for the people who are saying, I need you to take responsibility for this. So, so that's, I think, what you see is that vulnerability and introspection become the tools for leaders to begin to own the things that they've done, whether personally or as the leader of an organization and the actions of that organization. And I mean, is that very complicated? Is it very complex? Is it not probably as fast as anybody wants it to be to solve? Yes, to all of those things. But I think that's where you get to that idea of determination, right? Like that's an acknowledgement that like, I have looked within, there are some really hard things here for me personally and as an organization. And we're going to have to dig in, really listen, ask again, tell me more, in order to solve some of these things. But you know, we're here for it, and we're gonna do our very best.
Let's see here.
So many great questions here.
There
Thank
really
you all.
are.
I just want to say, you know, it's always, you know, it's a shame not to all be in the same room, but I also do continue to love that when we are able to do this remotely, we probably have a lot more people in this room than we would have if we were all in one place. So I know that there are hundreds of you out there right now that we're talking with, and we're doing it virtually, and it's a real pleasure. And thank you for your insights and your questions here.
All right. There's a question here that says, how do you navigate past white fragility when the competing business case is not being followed? I think that is a very valid question. It is the core of what so many in the DEI space are really trying to solve for with so many of their efforts. I can say that within our own organization, one of the things that we are really focused on right now is this notion of self-awareness. It really begins with you first and acknowledging your own biases and how that's impacted the way you show up as a leader and the decisions that you make. Because if you don't start first with yourself, no amount of unconscious bias training or diversity and inclusion training is really going to take root to be able to make the changes you need to within your company. And so we are going right now through a pilot program, which is a 6-week intensive program for a smaller group of employees. It's a class of about 10 people, where we are exploring it. And it's called Journey to Self-Awareness. It starts off with some more historical context, and then it gives us an opportunity to break out into smaller groups and have those very vulnerable conversations where we're all acknowledging that each and every one of us is bringing our own history, our own bias into the workplace. And how do we make sure that we're very conscious of that in those moments in how we are carrying forward with the actions and decisions that we make? And we've received a lot of really positive feedback. But the very simple answer is it starts with you first.
Yeah. And I mean, that gets to the next question I see, which I think in some ways you've already answered this, but companies are connecting recruiting, diversity, and inclusion with performance. And this is maybe more of a statement than a question, but certainly that is something that we're seeing more and more of. And I mean, I think this will no doubt be a theme across Social Innovation Summit for the next few days, which is, you know, how do you start to measure impact, and how does then transparency related to that measurement begin to drive change in an organization and across industries as well. And I think, you know, we've seen organizations like Intel start to build coalitions across the industry to better share transparency around that kind of data and best practices as a way to, you know, start to move the needle more significantly, and also recognize that, sure, we may be in competition for the best talent at any given organization, but this is also a collective project that we're all working on to raise the bar.
And look, the reality is that the new generation of talent coming into organizations is demanding it. It is literally the first question we get in every candidate interview now. what are you doing to address diversity, equity, and inclusion? So if your leaders aren't on board today with the importance of investing in these efforts, they're soon going to get on that bus quickly when they discover that they're not able to attract the talent that they need in the organization to continue that innovation engine and that business growth. It is just becoming critically important. And I think we've also seen the rise of employee activism. So if companies aren't willing to take that action for themselves, their employees are going to push for that and demand that in greater and greater ways. And so we have to be prepared as leaders and organizations to take a proactive stance, or find ourselves in a constant state of reacting to whatever the issue of the day is.
David has asked, do you find externalizing helpful, using an established charitable campaign or campaigns to help facilitate the discussions needed to address equity and mission-driven purpose? Which is a great question. And we didn't share a ton of this just now, but it did come up in the research, and you can actually see it in the report. There's some discussion about how leaders are thinking about that and breaking it down. But I will say that the answer is certainly yes. I think that organizations, to our earlier point, going it alone is never going to make a big enough impact. And so while there is certainly an instinct among organizations to find their own solution and activate that, it is really looking across the public-private partnership divide where you're really going to see significant impact. And, we do talk to a lot of organizations about then the most effective ways to do that. And I think one of the, and, I mentioned certainly that the leaders that we talked to were saying, it's not that check writing isn't important, it's that check writing isn't enough. That we also have to lend our own organizational expertise and understand better. And I think this is a measurement issue for organizations. We have to understand better our own organization's existing and potential impact. And that's both on the positive and negative side, but the potential impact gets really interesting, whether it's on issues of equity and justice, or whether it's about environmental sustainability. The ways that organizations can work together across the public-private divide can be really extraordinary. I think we are starting to see a lot of new ways of doing that blossom coming out of the last year, and a much greater focus on justice, certainly in the United States especially, but then also with much more focus from the public sector side with the change in administration in the United States. You start to see a real change in how we make those changes across that public-private divide.
I think we have time for one more question. And this one says, how do you balance your DEI efforts so it doesn't skew to women, for example, to the detriment of people of color or other affinity groups? This is the hardest part of the DEI job that every leader has to tackle. You want to create an inclusive and environment where everyone feels like they belong. And at the same time, it's really important to drive focus as part of your DEI efforts. Otherwise, if you're trying to address everything in the very broad spectrum of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you end up accomplishing nothing, because it very much feels like you're peanut buttering your efforts across any number of groups. So for example, when we created this role within the agency, I was very clear that in my first year, my priority was going to be on increasing BIPOC representation within the agency, because that is the place that we needed to make up the most ground. And it was incredibly important to our business growth and the culture that we were trying to create. That doesn't mean that other diversity and inclusion efforts aren't important, like ageism or veteran status or people with neurodiversity. Those things are important for an organization's diversity and belonging efforts. But I have to be very focused and clear on where our resources are going so that we can make meaningful impact against the goals that we've set forward for ourselves before expanding out further. So that's the guidance I give to anyone who asks about this. You have to focus, or you'll have a harder time making any traction.
Well, thank you, everyone. We've reached the end of our time. We could probably spend another 3 hours on this conversation with all of you. And I love seeing even these continuing questions and comments from everyone. So thank you so much for the time today. Speaking for myself, certainly, I've really enjoyed hearing from each of you. And I look forward to the rest of Social Innovation Summit. Thank you for spending time talking about the new ways we're thinking about purpose and leadership. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.